Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 7 deeply unsettling stories from backcountry roads across America, places where the pavement ends, the cell signal dies, and whatever lives out there has learned to wait. These are accounts from people who drove down the wrong road, parked in the wrong hollow, or stopped to help what they thought was a person in need. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Now turn off your lights and settle in. Story 1. The summer I turned 23, I was doing seasonal work for a timber survey company out of Asheville. Nothing glamorous. I rode with a 2-person crew. We'd get dropped at a grid coordinate, walk a transect, count and tag trees, then hike back out. Most days it was fine. Tedious, sweaty, a lot of ticks. I'd eaten so many gas station sandwiches that summer I'd started dreaming about the cellophane. My boots had a hole forming near the left toe. I kept telling myself I'd replace them when I got paid, which I kept not doing. The job that got to me was in late July, up near the Tennessee border, a stretch of land owned by some holding company that had never done anything with it. Our crew boss, a quiet man named Walt Ferris, dropped me and my coworker Priya Sundaram at the trailhead around 7 in the morning and said he'd be back by 4. The plan was a simple out and back. We had enough water, our equipment, 2 radios that worked fine in theory. The sky was that pale hazy blue that doesn't promise much, and the air smelled like iron and wet stone even though it hadn't rained in days. The first mile was uneventful. Priya was telling me about a show she'd been watching, something about competitive baking, and I was half listening and marking trees on my clipboard. We found a deer skeleton about 30 yards off trail, which we noted but didn't think much about. I noticed the creek running alongside us had gone totally quiet, no frogs, no skimmers, nothing moving in it. I filed that away and then forgot about it almost immediately, the way you do when you're focused on something else. The wrongness crept up on me slowly. Around mile 2, I started noticing the trees were changing, not in a dramatic way, just that the older growth was getting thicker, and the canopy was pressing down in a way that made the light feel yellowish. Priya had gone quiet too, though she didn't mention it. There was a smell I couldn't place, not rot exactly, more like copper. Warm copper, the way a handful of pennies gets warm in your palm. I told myself it was mineral runoff from the ridge above us. We had a lot of old mine country up in that area, and it wasn't unusual. I want to be clear about what happened next, because Priya and I talked about it afterward and we both agreed on the details, which matters to me. We stopped to take a water break and reset our bearings, and I looked up from my clipboard and noticed something hanging between 2 yellow birches about 40 feet off the trail. I thought at first it was surveyor's tape left by a previous crew, but when I looked more carefully, I saw it was wire. Thin wire wound from tree to tree, and hanging from it at intervals were small white shapes. Bones. Not uniform, not a single animal. They were mixed, different sizes. Some curved, some straight, strung on the wire with what looked like black thread. And on the wire itself, at the center, someone had wound what appeared to be a strip of dark bark, and carved into it were long repeating lines, almost like ladder rungs but uneven, tilted at angles that felt deliberate. Priya saw me staring and came to stand beside me. Neither of us said anything for a moment. "Hunter probably," she said finally. She didn't sound convinced. I didn't say anything. The thing that bothered me, the thing I kept coming back to, was that there was no trail leading to those trees. No broken brush, no footprints, no bent grass. Whatever had hung that wire had reached those birches without walking to them. That's what I couldn't make fit. We marked the location on our GPS and kept going because that was the job, but neither of us talked much after that. The trail got narrower, and at some point I realized we hadn't heard a bird since the first mile. Not one. The woods were running in complete silence except for our footsteps, and my footsteps were louder than they should have been, like the ground was hollow underfoot in places. We reached our endpoint, logged what we needed, and turned around. That's when Priya grabbed my arm. She pointed to the trail ahead of us. Right in the center, in soft earth between two tree roots, was a single boot print, deep, like whoever made it was heavy or moving fast. Pointing toward us, meaning they'd been walking in our direction, toward our endpoint. There were no other prints, none leading to it, none leading away. It sat there in the dirt like a period at the end of a sentence I didn't understand. "That wasn't here when we came through," Priya said. She was right. I'd been looking down the whole time, occupational habit, and that print hadn't been there on our way out. It had appeared while we were standing at our endpoint, maybe a quarter mile ahead of where we stood now. We did not run, but we moved faster than we'd moved all day. I kept looking left into the trees without meaning to, some reflex I couldn't shut off. The copper smell was stronger now, and the air had gone noticeably cooler even though it was barely noon. My radio crackled once and then went dead, even though the battery had been full when we checked it that morning. Priya's worked fine. I heard it when we were maybe a half mile from the trailhead. A sound from the trees to my right, not footsteps exactly, more like something dragging. Long and slow, like a heavy branch being pulled across the ground. It kept pace with us. I told myself it was a deer, and I kept telling myself that, and then it stopped and I heard something else. Breathing. Deliberate, measured breathing, maybe 20 feet into the trees. Not labored, not frightened. Steady and patient, like whatever it was had been breathing that way for a long time. I made the mistake of stopping to listen. Priya pulled my sleeve hard enough that my shoulder ached, and we walked fast the last half mile without speaking. We sat in the open field at the trailhead for an hour and 40 minutes before Walt pulled up. When I loaded my gear into the truck bed, I noticed a smear on the back window of the crew cab, a long, greasy streak, like a palm pressed flat and dragged downward. Walt said it hadn't been there that morning. He said it without looking at me, and he didn't ask any more about it. I quit the job 2 weeks later, told myself it was the pay, which it partially was. I still check the tree line when I'm anywhere wooded and still. I don't know what was in those trees. I don't want to. Story 2. My grandmother on my father's side had a piece of land up in the Ozarks she never talked about. Not in the way people don't talk about things they don't care about. She didn't talk about it the way you don't talk about something that has weight. She de-owned it since before my dad was born, a dozen or so acres off a dirt road somewhere in McDonald County, Missouri. And when she passed, she left it to my dad, and when my dad couldn't deal with the paperwork, it eventually defaulted to me. I was 31, living in Tulsa, working in purchasing for a medical supply company. I drove up on a Thursday in October. I thought I'd be back by Sunday. I should tell you my grandmother was not a superstitious woman. She'd been a schoolteacher for 30 years. She clipped coupons and watched procedural crime dramas and had strong opinions about the correct way to make cornbread. She was not the type to leave things unsaid without reason, which is why I'd always remembered what she said when I was about 13, the one time I asked her why she never went back up there. She'd been quiet for a moment, rinsing dishes at the sink, and then she said, "That land has something on it that was there before us. It doesn't owe us anything." And that was all she ever said about it. I thought about that on the drive up. I had 2 coffees from a gas station in Joplin and a road atlas because my phone signal had already gone patchy. The trees came in close on both sides of the highway and got closer when I turned off onto the county road, and then closer still when I turned onto the unmarked track that my grandmother's deed described. It was early afternoon, but the light through the canopy had that flattened gray quality of late evening, and the leaves were past peak color, mostly brown, and they made no sound when the occasional one fell because the ground was too soft to crackle. The cabin was smaller than I'd expected. A single room with a sleeping loft, a cold wood stove, a door that dragged badly against the frame, and a window in the south wall that faced a small clearing. The clearing was maybe 30 yards across, ringed with older trees, and the grass in it was a slightly different color than the grass around the cabin, paler, almost silvery, even accounting for the overcast sky. I told myself it was a soil difference. There was a rusted hand pump near the tree line, and beyond it the land dipped into what felt like a natural bowl, though the trees were too dense to see far into it. The cabin smelled like cold ash and something faintly sweet, like fruit left too long in a bowl. I propped the door open and spent the first hour sweeping out mouse droppings, checking the floorboards, looking at what would need fixing. There was a coffee can near the wood stove with a handful of old nails and some folded papers inside, old deed receipts by the look of them. I set it aside. The loft ladder was solid. I found a rusted camp lantern hanging on a nail and lit it with the lighter I'd brought. By the time I'd gotten the wood stove going and eaten the sandwich I'd packed, it was late afternoon and the light through that south window had gone an even deep gray. The fire was good. I felt okay. I had a book I'd been meaning to start for months, a thick paperback about the Korean War that I'd been carrying in my bag since January. I read about 40 pages without incident, which felt almost like a normal evening. The sound I heard first was tapping. I want to be precise about this. It wasn't a knock and it wasn't scratching, it was tapping, like someone rapping two knuckles against wood, rhythmic, unhurried. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps. I told myself a branch was hitting the cabin wall in a breeze, but when I listened I couldn't hear any wind at all. The trees outside the window were completely still. I went to the door and opened it and looked out at the clearing. Nothing. The pale grass stood motionless. The tree line was dark. The tapping had stopped. I stood there for a minute, feeling vaguely foolish, and went back inside. It started again about 20 minutes later from the opposite wall, the north wall, the one that faced the bowl. Same rhythm, 3 and pause, 3 and pause. I put my book face down on my knee and listened until it stopped on its own after maybe a minute and a half. I slept badly. I'd brought a sleeping bag and laid it in the loft, and I lay in it staring at the low, slanted ceiling and listening to the cabin settle, which old cabins do, which I know. But there was one sound that wasn't settling, a slow, irregular creak from the ladder below the loft, as if someone was putting weight on the bottom rung and then releasing it. I did not look over the edge. I told myself 100 things. I told myself the wood stove heat was creating air currents. I told myself an animal had gotten under the cabin. I told myself my nerves were running hot from the isolation and the drive and the coffees. I was almost asleep when something brushed the outside wall of the loft. Low near the floor, not a drag, not a scratch or pressure, something pressing against the exterior boards as if testing them, and then moving slowly along the wall toward the corner. It was measured, patient. Whatever was outside was not in a hurry. I lay completely still until the sky lightened. In the morning, I went outside and walked the perimeter of the cabin. The ground on the north side, between the cabin and the tree line, was soft from a light frost, and I could see my own boot prints clearly from where I'd walked the night before. Alongside them, pressed into the earth near the north wall, was a series of depressions. Not footprints, no defined heel or toe, more like a heavy cylindrical weight had been set down and dragged in short intervals. The spacing was roughly 2 feet. There were 9 of them, running parallel to the wall, and they stopped at the corner. Where they stopped, the bark on the corner log of the cabin had been worn smooth for about a foot, as if something had pressed hard against it repeatedly, and the bark had simply given way. I packed my bag and left before 9. I didn't lock the cabin because the lock was broken and I hadn't thought to fix it, and I haven't gone back to look into what that would cost. My dad asked me once how the property looked. I told him it needed a lot of work. He didn't ask follow-up questions. I think that's what my grandmother would have done too. Story 3. I need to tell you up front that I'm not someone who spooks easily. I grew up in a small town in the high desert of eastern Nevada, and if you've spent time in that landscape real time, not passing through on the interstate, you understand that big empty is just big empty, and things that feel sinister are usually explainable. The night sky is bright enough to navigate by. Animals make sounds. Wind does strange things in rock formations. I went to school for geology, spent 3 summers doing fieldwork in isolated basins, and if there's one thing field science builds in you, it's a functional relationship with being alone in the middle of nowhere. So I want that context when I tell you about the road north of Piach. I was driving back from a fieldwork site in late September, a solo job for a small environmental consulting firm. Soil sampling along a proposed pipeline corridor, very routine. I'd finished the day's sampling and was heading back toward the highway in my firm's white pickup, and I made a wrong turn. I know that sounds simple and stupid, and it was. The dirt roads out there form these informal grids that don't match any map cleanly, and it was dusk, and my GPS was pulling satellite poorly in the canyon shadows. I'd been driving for about 15 minutes on a road I thought looped back to the main track when I realized the terrain was wrong. I dropped into a canyon draw I didn't recognize, and the road was getting narrower. I stopped and got out to check my paper maps, which I kept in a rubber-banded roll in the glove box, old habit from field school. The air outside was sharp, that dry cold you get in the desert when the sun goes. I had a half tank of gas, my sampling equipment, 3 water bottles, a first aid kit, and a bag of trail mix that was mostly chocolate chips at that point, because I'd been eating around the oats all week. I'd found a good podcast that morning about deep ocean geology. The sampling had gone cleanly. It had been a routine day. Standing by the truck, orienting my map in the last good light, I noticed the canyon walls were close on both sides, maybe 30 yards, and the rock was dark basalt streaked with something lighter. The road continued ahead, descending. Behind me, it curved out of sight around a boulder. There was no wind at all. The silence was the kind that has texture to it, dense and close, like the canyon was holding its breath. I found my position on the map. The road ahead ended. It was a spur, no outlet. I'd have to reverse out the way I came. Annoying but not catastrophic. That's when I heard the sound. It came from ahead of me down the spur where the road continued. A single, low tone, almost sub-vocal, like someone humming a note without moving their mouth. Sustained, no variation in pitch, going for maybe 10 full seconds before stopping. I stood by the truck and waited, watching the darkening road ahead. I told myself it was wind across a rock formation. These slot canyons can produce exactly that kind of resonance. I've heard it before, but there was no wind. The second time it started, I realized the tone wasn't coming from a single direction. It was surrounding me. Not loud, not overwhelming, but coming from the canyon walls themselves, as if the rock were vibrating from within. I got back in the truck and started reversing immediately. The road was narrow enough that I had to go slowly and carefully, one eye on the rear view. In the rear view, in the last gray light, I saw something on the road in front of me, the direction I'd been pointed before I turned around, about 60 feet back, standing in the center of the track. My headlights hadn't reached it, but the sky still had enough light for a silhouette. It was tall, taller than a person by at least 1.5 feet, and it was standing completely still. And what registered in my brain before anything else was that the proportions were wrong. The torso was too short. The legs were too long. The arms hung at its sides, and they were wrong too, not dramatically, not comically, just enough that when I tried to assemble the shape into something familiar, it wouldn't hold. Like a picture of a person taken from a slightly wrong angle, all the pieces present but the ratios just slightly off. I stopped reversing without meaning to. The tone started again. I couldn't tell anymore if it was coming from the canyon or from the figure. I reversed out of that canyon faster than I should have on that road, and I hit a rock with the back tire hard enough to bounce the truck, and I kept going anyway. When I reached the junction I'd turned off from, I stopped and took a breath and looked at my hands, which were shaking. Not a little shaking properly, the way they do after something dumps adrenaline into you faster than your body prepared for. I sat there for about a minute. In the bed of the truck, underneath my sampling equipment and the rubber case my core tubes rode in, something shifted. A single movement, like something small adjusting its weight. I can tell you I was rational enough to consider that my gear had rolled. I considered that long enough to get out and check. Everything in the bed was exactly as I'd stowed it. Nothing had moved. The drive back to the highway took 20 minutes. I didn't hear the tone again. When I unloaded at the firm's equipment bay the next morning, I found one of my soil core tubes had cracked clean through the middle without anything touching it. The material inside was intact, the rubber housing was fine, just the hard plastic tube, split evenly along its length from the inside out. I've done field work in the Nevada desert 4 times since. I haven't gone back to that stretch north of Piach. Story 4. My older sister Donna and I had this thing where once a year we'd take a long drive together, no destination, just pick a direction on a Friday afternoon and see where we ended up. It started when she was learning to drive and I was 12 and our parents were going through a rough patch. She'd take the car out for practice and I'd come along to keep her calm and we'd just drive. When she moved to Portland for work and I stayed in Montana, it became an annual excuse to see each other, rent a car, and go somewhere neither of us had been. This was 4 years ago. The weekend of the 5th of September, I think, maybe the 12th. She'd flown in and we'd rented a small SUV from the Hertz near my apartment, loaded up with snacks, and headed south into the Bitterroot Valley with vague plans to explore some of the back roads down toward the Idaho Panhandle. Donna had a playlist she'd spent 3 weeks curating. I'd brought a cooler with too much sparkling water and not enough real food, which she gave me grief about immediately. We were in good moods. The first day was fine, easy. We drove south through the valley and the light was golden and the mountains were still half green. Donna took a lot of pictures on her phone. We found a diner in a town whose name I honestly can't remember. Small place, vinyl booths, excellent pie, and ate too much and kept driving until it was nearly dark and we stopped at a motel outside Darby. Second day we drove west into the forest roads, which were exactly the kind of rough, unmarked tracks we'd been looking for. I want to be clear that everything felt fine for most of that second day. We drove slowly, windows down, and we talked about things we hadn't had time to talk about. Her job situation, my lease ending in December, our mother's health. Real things, good conversation. The road we were on petered out eventually at a turnaround, and we got out and sat on the hood of the SUV and ate peanut butter crackers and looked at the tree line and felt very at peace with things. The drive back started at around 4:30. I was behind the wheel. Donna was reading something on her phone in the passenger seat. The track wound back through a section of older forest, heavier canopy, and I had my headlights on because the tree cover was dense enough to block most of the late afternoon sun. Donna told me to stop the car. She said it calmly, and I pulled over and said what, and she pointed through the passenger window into the trees. About 20 feet in, there was a woman, or something in the shape of a woman, standing between 2 large ponderosas with her back to us. She was wearing a pale yellow dress or shirt, something light-colored, and her hair was loose and dark. She was completely still. "Should we see if she's okay?" Donna said. I looked at the woman, and something about the stillness was wrong in a way I couldn't name immediately. She wasn't standing the way a person stands when they stop to rest, weight on one hip, shoulder dropped, head angled. She was perfectly upright, absolutely balanced in a way that felt static, like something placed rather than something arrived. "Roll down your window," I said, not because I wanted to call out, but because I wanted to hear if there was anything to hear. Donna rolled down her window and we both listened. The woman turned her head. The head turned farther than heads turn, not in one sudden snap, but slowly with a smoothness that felt motorized until her face was pointing directly at the car, which should have been fine. She'd heard us and looked over. Normal, but the rest of her body hadn't moved. Not her shoulders, not her hips. Just the head turned completely backward relative to her torso, looking directly at us while her body still faced the other direction. And her face was, I can't do this full justice, her face was composed. Not frightened, not confused, not even curious. Still, as if she'd been expecting us and wasn't particularly interested. Donna made a sound that wasn't a word. I put the SUV in reverse, then thought better of it and did a 3-point turn because reversing on that track in the dark felt like a worse idea, and I drove out. Neither of us talked for about 20 minutes. We got back to the main road and the light opened up and I finally let out a breath I'd been holding since the turnaround. When we got back to the motel, Donna looked through the photos she'd taken during the day, trying to find any that had captured the area around where we'd been. One of the pictures she'd taken in the late afternoon, a wide shot of the road ahead with the tree line on both sides, had a pale shape at the very edge of the frame, in the trees on the passenger side. Just the edge of something light-colored among the darker trunks, too indistinct to make out. Donna had taken it more than an hour before we'd stopped. Donna lives in Portland. I moved to Bozeman. We still do the annual drive. We haven't gone back to the bitter root. Story 5. My name for the purposes of this story is not important. But what I'll tell you is that I was 38 years old. I'd been driving long-haul freight on and off since I was 26. And I had put more nighttime miles on empty 2-lane roads than most people will ever see in their entire lives. I am telling you this because I need you to understand that I am not someone who confuses an animal on the shoulder for a person, or a deer crossing for something unusual, or road hypnosis for anything more than road hypnosis. I have been driving those roads for a long time and I know what I know. This was a stretch of Route 17 in the Shasta Trinity National Forest, late November, around 2 in the morning. I was running light, empty trailer, heading back to the distribution hub near Redding after a drop-off. The road through that section runs beside the Trinity River for a while and then climbs up through dense timber. And there are 15 or 20 miles in there where there's nothing, no structures, no turnoffs, no other traffic on a Tuesday night in late autumn. I'd driven it enough times that I could almost narrate it from memory. Cracked guardrail at mile marker 42. The burned-out section of forest on the east side around 47. The pull-off near the river at 51 that truckers used for rest stops. I pulled into that rest stop around 2:10 because I'd been on since 9 and wanted 15 minutes of closed eyes. Killed the engine, ate the last granola bar I had. I'd been listening to a sports call-in show that had cut to commercials, and in the silence I could hear the river below, which was running high from recent rain. I was almost asleep when I heard the knock on my door. Not a tap, not a soft knock. A knock, 3 measured impacts on the driver's side door at a height that was exactly where a person's knuckles would fall. I sat up and looked through the window and there was nothing there. The pull-off was empty. The road was empty in both directions as far as my running lights reached. I sat there and breathed for a minute. I told myself another trucker had pulled in and walked over and then changed their mind. But I hadn't heard another engine, and the gravel at that pull-off is loose and shifts audibly under tires. I hadn't heard anything. The knock came again, same side, same height, 3 times, same interval. I turned on my cab lights and looked in both mirrors. The pull-off was empty. The tree line was dark and close on the uphill side of the road, maybe 20 feet from my door. I was not going to open that door. I want to be clear about that. I am experienced and I am sensible, and I was not going to open that door. What I did do was lean over and look through the driver's side window from the passenger seat, getting a different angle. I pressed my face close to the glass. What I saw directly outside my door was a hand, pressed flat against the lower panel of the door below the window where I wouldn't have seen it from the driver's seat. A left hand, fingers spread, pressing with noticeable pressure against the metal. I could see the door panel flex slightly. The fingers were too long. Not grotesquely, just each finger was a half knuckle too long, so the hand was narrow and the fingers splayed wider than a hand should. There was no sleeve visible, no wrist visible. The hand simply appeared from the bottom of the frame and pressed. I started the truck. Whatever was outside either heard the engine or felt the vibration because the hand pulled back and I heard something step back on the gravel, 1 step, 2, and then nothing. I pulled out onto the road without looking in my mirror, and I drove the remaining 40 miles to Reading with all my lights on and the radio up loud. In the morning, when I did my pre-trip inspection in the yard, the area of the driver's door where the hand had pressed, just that rectangular section of the door panel, lower left, had a shallow concavity in the metal. Not a dent from impact, a depression like something had pushed steadily inward over time. The paint had not cracked. The metal had simply yielded. My dispatcher asked if I'd backed into something. I said I must have. He wrote it up for bodywork and I thanked him and went home and slept for 11 hours. I still run that highway occasionally. I've stopped at that pull-off exactly once since in daylight, and I sat in my truck for maybe 3 minutes and then left. The gravel is loose the way it always was. The river runs the way it always does. There's nothing there that's obviously wrong. That's the part that still bothers me. Story 6. I was 7 years out of grad school and broke in the specific way that people who spend too long in academia get broke, functionally employed, but hollowed out by decisions that had made sense once and no longer did. I'd been teaching adjunct composition at a community college in Flagstaff for 3 years, living in a 1-bedroom apartment that smelled like the previous tenant's cat. When my uncle Hector Reyes, my mother's youngest brother, not someone I'd been particularly close to, died and left me a small piece of land and a camper trailer in the White Mountains of eastern Arizona, it felt like a sign. Looking back, I can see that I was in the kind of state where signs feel meaningful because you're desperate for direction. But it also felt, practically speaking, like a solution. I could live in the camper cheaply while I figured things out. Hector had apparently been running a small hunting camp out there, renting it seasonally, and I had romantic ideas about fixing it up and doing the same. I took a leave of absence from the college in late August and drove out. The land was 2 lots joined together on a dirt road off State Route 273, about 12 miles from the nearest small town. The camper was a late 90s Fleetwood, serviceable, smelling of pipe tobacco and old coffee. There was a generator shed, an outhouse that had been upgraded to a composting toilet, and a fire ring surrounded by log benches. The hunting camp, such as it was, consisted of a parking area and a small wooden equipment locker with a combination lock I didn't know the code to. The forest was ponderosa pine, dense and tall, and the ground was carpeted in long needles that made everything soft and quiet. I spent the first 3 days doing basic maintenance, clearing gutters, checking the camper's water system, chopping wood from a half-cord Hector had left covered by a tarp. I found his camp logbook in a drawer in the camper, which guests had apparently used to leave notes about their hunts. Most entries were routine: dates, species, weather. A few were complaints about the outhouse or the road condition. The last entry in the log was in Hector's handwriting, dated 3 weeks before he died. It just said, "Don't go to the second hollow after dark. I mean it." He de-underlined it twice. I read it 4 or 5 times and decided it was a joke for whatever hunter was coming after him. On my 5th night there, I was sitting outside by the fire ring around 9 o'clock, reading, when the dog that lived at the nearest property down the road, big brown shepherd mix that had come by to beg scraps twice, started barking from somewhere in the trees on the far side of my clearing. Not excited barking. Sustained, low, defensive barking, the kind that means the dog has placed itself and isn't backing down but also isn't moving forward. I went inside. The barking continued for about 20 minutes, then cut off sharply. Not a trailing off, a cut, immediate silence. I told myself the dog had gone home or the deer was barking and had moved off. I told myself these things and I made tea and I was fairly convinced by them. At some point close to midnight I woke up. I wasn't sure what woke me. The camper was quiet and dark, and the only sound was the wind in the pines outside, which was a consistent low-register sound I'd gotten used to. I lay there and listened, and the wind was there, and then there was something under it, a sound from the far end of the camper, from the direction of the small rear window above the sleeping area. Humming. A low, not quite tuneful humming just outside the window. Close enough that it could have been someone standing a foot from the glass. It had a strange quality. It wasn't melodic, it wasn't random. It was rhythmic in a way that felt intentional, like counting, like marking time. I did not move. I want to be honest about the specific nature of what I felt, which was not the sharp electric fear I might have expected, but a heavy, settled dread, the kind that presses you down rather than launching you forward. I lay flat and didn't move, and the humming continued for what felt like a very long time but was probably 5 or 6 minutes. And then a voice came, through the thin aluminum wall of the camper, muffled but recognizable. A man's voice, low, speaking in a cadence that sounded like conversation, not words I could make out, but the rhythm and music of someone talking to someone else. It went on for maybe 30 seconds, then another voice responded, higher, briefer. The same pattern repeated, first voice, second voice, pause, first voice again. Like a conversation I was only hearing the sound of, not the content. I knew no one was supposed to be on my land. I lay there until the voices stopped, which happened all at once, mid-sentence it seemed, like a recording cut off. I did not sleep again until it was light. In the morning I walked the perimeter of the camper. The ground was soft and needled and held impressions well. On the far side, below the rear window, the pine needles had been disturbed in a rough oval, as if by standing and shifting, and in the center of that disturbance was a single impression, one knee pressed into the soft earth, deep enough that the outline was clean and clear. Just one knee, no other sign of approach, no footprints leading to or from it. I drove to town and called my cousin Elena Reyes, Hector's daughter, and asked her what the note in the logbook meant. She was quiet for a moment and then said she wasn't sure, but that Hector had been having bad nights in the last month of his life and she hadn't taken it seriously. She asked if I was okay. I said I was fine. I didn't go back to the camper that night. I drove back a week later to collect my things in the middle of the afternoon and haven't been back since. I did rent the camp out once last year. The hunter who stayed sent me a message after his 3-night stay. He didn't mention the hollow. He said the hunting was good and asked if he could book again next September. I told him the property was under renovation. Story 7. The last time I talked to my friend Cade Albright, we were sitting in a gas station parking lot outside of Maupin, Oregon, eating cheeseburgers from a bag, and he was telling me that the road we'd been looking for all week was definitely the one a gas station attendant in Antelope had described to him 3 days earlier. I'd been skeptical of the whole trip from the start. Cade was a photographer, legitimately talented, landscape and rural decay. He had a small following online. And he had this idea that there was a stretch of road somewhere in the Deschutes country that had been featured in a 1970s photograph he'd found at an estate sale, a black and white image of a long straight road running through high desert to a single dark structure on the horizon. He wanted to find it and reshoot it. Reasonable idea. Reasonable person. I was between jobs. I'd been doing digital marketing contracts for a few years and had a slow month. And Cade offered to pay for gas if I drove, because I had a proper truck and he had a Subaru that he was convinced would not survive the road conditions. So I drove and he navigated, and we'd spent 3 days looking for this road without finding it, eating too much fast food and arguing companionably about the route. The morning after the parking lot, we found it, or we found something that matched the description. A long straight section of county road running due east across dry plateau, with a structure in the distance that turned out to be a collapsed hay barn. Cade was satisfied enough to call it and spent 2 hours shooting while I sat on the truck tailgate and read the novel I'd been carrying around. The light was good and the plateau was wide and flat and exposed, and you could see for miles in every direction, which I liked. There was nowhere for anything to hide out there, which in retrospect was a thought I shouldn't have needed to have. We wrapped up in early afternoon and started back. The road back involved a stretch through the Warm Springs forest, retracing a route we'd come in on, and we got into the trees about an hour before sunset. Cade was reviewing shots on his camera in the passenger seat, and I was watching the road, and we were talking about nothing. What we'd do when we got back to Portland, a movie he'd seen, whether the apartment over mine had a leak or if the water I'd seen on my ceiling was condensation. The road had a long sweeping curve, and when I came around it, I hit the brakes without thinking. There was a figure in the road, standing in the center of the lane, completely still, about 100 yards ahead. My first thought was exactly what it should have been. Someone having car trouble, or hurt, or lost. The figure was upright, not moving, and I put on my hazards and slowed to a stop about 50 yards back, and Cade put down his camera. "Is that a person?" he said. I said I thought so, and I hit my high beams. In the high beams, the figure was a man or man-shaped. Tall, wearing what looked like a dark coat, standing with his arms slightly away from his body, chin down. The skin of his face, what I could see of it in the lights, was wrong in a way I registered before I could identify why. Textured, not like skin, more like the surface of birch bark, pale and faintly patterned with horizontal lines. "That's not right," Cade said. He said it quietly, almost to himself. I was already putting the truck in reverse. The figure didn't move as I backed up. It just stood. When I'd backed around the curve enough to break the line of sight, I turned around in a wide spot and drove out the way we'd come in, added an extra 45 minutes to our route going around on the highway, and neither of us talked about what we'd seen until we were back in Maupin and in a diner with fluorescent lights and other people around. What Cade told me then was this. When I'd hit the high beams, he'd raised his camera out of habit, the way photographers do. He'd taken a single frame before he told himself to put it down. On the camera screen in the image from that one frame, the figure in the road was in the center of the frame exactly where we'd seen him. But the face in the photograph, and this is what Cade told me in a fluorescent diner in Maupin, turning his camera toward me to show me, the face in the photograph had no features, not obscured by shadow or distance, simply absent. A pale oval where a face should have been, as smooth as an egg. Cade deleted the photo before we left the diner. I didn't try to stop him. I understood. We drove back to Portland mostly in silence. Cade still does landscape photography, good work. I still follow him. We've talked plenty of times since. We don't talk about the Deschutes Road. I think we've both decided that the agreement is easier than the alternative. But sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night on a long straight road with trees pressing in on both sides, I hit my high beams earlier than I need to, just to see what's ahead, just to make sure the road is empty. It usually is. Thanks for watching Dark Horror Stories. If these kept you up tonight, hit that like button and subscribe. We put out new stories every week, and there are plenty more roads you haven't heard about yet. Drop a comment telling me which story got under your skin the most, and if you know someone who needs a reason not to drive alone at night, share this with them. Until next time, keep the lights on and maybe don't stop for directions.